That's Speedy. Slate 1, Roll 1, interview with Phil Koch, film Vietnam. Yeah, okay, mate. Phil, what were your reasons for going to Vietnam?
Well, it was the world's top story. It was beginning to be then in 1967. I'd been in Indonesia for 3 years, which was then the top story. And that was the real motivation. Aside from that, there were the other personal things about how you'd be yourself in a war situation, a real war situation, how you'd perform, what it would show up in you personally.
How do you feel about the comment that journalists are just boys playing soldiers in another make-believe world?
I think it's up to the individual, but that's not an unfair comment, really, with a lot of the people that I knew. There were a lot of correspondents walking around with a sidearm strapped on their hip. We used to call them gung-hos.
Were you going there to try and prove yourself, you think?
To myself a little bit. I didn't talk about it. I never wore a sidearm and wouldn't have on a principle, but incidentally, not concerning the war, on the principle that I wouldn't wear a gun. I wasn't there to shoot anybody. I was there to report it. I couldn't understand the ones that did.
You said before about you wanted to go back into a war zone, or you want to confront a real war. You'd been in Indonesia, Borneo. That wasn't a real war. Why go to Vietnam?
I think Vietnam was a war. The other was a situation that grew and became violent at times in sudden flare-ups. I actually, as the war went on in Vietnam, in retrospect, I had more dangerous situations in Vietnam that happened to me personally. But
in Vietnam?
In Indonesia. But no, Vietnam was a war in those terms, in the, if you like, in the Hemingway attitude.
Can you go on to explain about that? Did you have a hang-up with Hemingway and having to be the young buck proving himself?
I grew up on Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and Cannery Row and those type of books. Very, very different thing to the young journalists that came on at the beginning of the 70s to that war. They had very different attitudes to it.
What was it about the Ernest Hemingway character that you liked, that you tried to identify with?
I identified with the adventure of it.
Why do you think it's necessary for young men to go out and prove themselves through going to war?
I think in most young men, certainly of my generation and before, there was that feeling of proving. There was that feeling that war was a proving situation.
Why is it? Is it because man is an animal, or is it something that we're conditioned to think?
Oh, I think man's a warring man.
But women, what about women? Why don't they go off to war and try and do the same things?
They're wiser.
Can you tell me about the press corps? Go on to explain why you think the press corps changed from your generation and a new generation that came through later on in the war.
Well, there were over 300 accredited correspondents when I was there, of differing ages. There were many Second World War correspondents in Vietnam when I was there, Korean War correspondents. Now, these men had certain attitudes, and in fact, I suppose I identified with their lives a little bit.
You tried to mould yourself upon them?
Oh, no, I was my own man, but and experiencing it for myself, more importantly. But what I'm trying to say is that that press corps also had in it much, much younger men who'd had a different style of education. If I could take you back very briefly, when I was a boy, 18, and Australia had national service, no one protested that. The people that I went into national service with, I went into the Navy, enjoyed it. They didn't seek to protest that as an act of the Australian government that wasn't good for them.
So what you're saying is the journalists who came through towards the late 60s, early 70s, they were a different ilk and definitely anti-war, and that came across in their reporting.
Oh, and they were more investigatory journalists. Very importantly, I was a hard newsman. I'd run up anything, but journalism today has a far more investigatory aspect to it. Far more study goes into the why do it.
And do you think the ABC is guilty of not following that up enough, of not allowing their journalists to be interpretive, at least during the Vietnam War?
Oh no, I think the ABC led it. We opened public affairs in that period. We were the first. AM, and then PM, and then TDT.
Could you get up on ABC television or radio, though, and say, I think this war is futile, pointless, or express a personal opinion?
Not then. Not in 1967. But what I am saying is that the ABC, to my mind, comes up very well on this, is that we developed in the ABC to the point where we were allowing our younger journalists, the ones that came after me, to broaden out what they wanted to say. Public opinion altered as to attitude as to what you could say. But I think that the ABC was very much in the forefront of this altering style of journalism.
Tony Ferguson, ABC journalist up there, said that he had an interview with Wilfred Burchett that was sent back to Australia and destroyed because it was too hot politically. What do you think about that?
I recall it, that's so.
That happened, did it?
Yes, yes.
How do you explain the ABC's subscribing to being objective or guardian of free press?
Wilfred Burchett was regarded as an enemy of Australia at that point in time by a lot of people. I think as late as 75 he came out to try and lay that to rest in Australia. He was allowed into Viet Cong areas where no other Western correspondent at all was allowed. He worked out of Hanoi and Phnom Penh in that period.
Wouldn't this have allowed him to, even if he was on their side or took a sympathetic view, wouldn't that in terms of objectivity allowed him to give another side of the war, one that wasn't reported?
Yes, indeed. And in retrospect, he ought to have been heard on our channels at that time. What I am saying is, several years later, Tony Ferguson would have found no difficulty in putting that report to air. Why
did management change in those years then?
They changed like the governments of the day changed, like the country changed. A totally changed attitude as to what Australia's commitments and interests were.
Why do you think Australia was there?
Australia was there solely as a support, a political commitment to the United States. All the way with LBJ. We had a battalion there. That wasn't going to win the war or help win the war. It was simply to show that the Australian relationship with the United States stood in that strength. And the ANZUS situation was involved in it.
In terms of the Hemingway romantic young man, do you think that... I lost my point there. We'll cut there, I think.